Welcome back for another deep dive. This time, we're taking on something pretty huge emotions, this incredible mix of feelings and thoughts and reactions that basically just color our whole lives. And I have got excerpts here from The Psychology of Emotion, From Everyday Life to Theory by Kenneth T. Strongman. And thankfully, I'm joined by our expert to help us untangle some of the big mysteries about how emotions actually work.
It's funny, even defining emotion is like a challenge for psychologists. You think it's something that's so like core to the human experience would be easy to pin down, but it's just not.
I know, right? It seems like everybody knows what an emotion is until you try to actually put it into words. The book jumps right into that, saying that
Mm.
you can hardly talk about emotion without some kind of cognitive element.
Yeah, that's a really important point. It brings up that whole question of, do our thoughts shape our emotions, or do our emotions come first and then kind of influence our thoughts? It's a bit of a chicken or the egg thing.
Yeah, it really is. And then there's that whole debate about whether emotions are kind of like disruptive forces in our lives or whether they serve really specific functions. I always wondered about that myself. Sometimes my feelings feel like they totally get in the way, but then other times they feel so crucial for making decisions.
Yeah, and that's a tension that comes up in a lot of these theories that we're going to be looking at. Are emotions something that throws us off balance, or are they actually sophisticated responses that help us navigate the world?
So defining emotion, trickier than it seems. Let's unpack some of the ways psychologists have tried to make sense of this whole emotional roller coaster. And the book takes us through a whole bunch of different theories. Instinctive, phenomenological, behavioral, physiological, evolutionary, cognitive. I mean, it's a lot.
Yeah, it's a real whirlwind tour.
Yeah.
But each of these theories gives us a different lens to look at how emotions operate. So some of those early theories, like William James, he was all about the instinctive basis of emotions, the idea that they're hardwired into us from birth. Oh, okay. So a baby's cry when they're hungry, or toddlers joyful laughter. Would those be examples of these instinctive emotions?
Totally. But then you've got the phenomenological theories, and they emphasize the individual's subjective experience. And the textbook gives this great example. A woman who's anxiously waiting for a phone call, she can go through this whole range of emotions just based on her own interpretations of why that phone isn't ringing.
That's so true.
It reminds us that the same event can trigger totally different feelings in different
Oh,
people.
yeah, for sure. I remember waiting for a call back about a job offer once, and I was just a wreck, convinced they were going to tell me I didn't get it. But it turned out they were just running behind.
Perfect illustration. It's not just the event itself, but it's our thoughts, it's our interpretations that kind of fuel the emotional fire. So it's not just about those hardwired responses. Our thoughts play a big role. And speaking of learning and behavior, the book then gets into behavioral theories, which suggest that emotions are connected to learned responses. But how do you tease apart behavior that's driven by emotion versus just something else? It feels like a blurry line sometimes.
It is a bit blurry. I mean, think about it. Is crying always a sign of sadness? Could it be relief? Could it even be joy? Context matters a lot, and that's something that behavioral theories sometimes struggle to account for.
Okay, that makes sense. So next we've got these physiological theories, which are all about trying to find the biological roots of emotion in the brain and the body. And they've been on this quest to find specific patterns of brain activity or bodily changes that are linked to each emotion.
Yeah, and one concept that the book touches on is the central motive state. The idea that our bodies have these internal systems for regulating things like hunger or thirst, and these systems create the sort of physiological push that interacts with our environment. So for example, if you're hungry, your body goes through certain changes, and then the sight or the smell of food becomes even more enticing.
Oh, so it's like our bodies are giving us these clues about what we need,
Yeah,
and our emotions are part of that communication system.
exactly.
Okay. Then the book throws out this term, translimbic command systems. That sounds kind of intense. Is this where things start to get really technical?
It does sound kind of sci-fi, right?
Yeah.
But basically, it's this idea that there are these networks of brain regions, they span different areas, and they're essential for generating and processing emotions. And so you can imagine how a system like that, if it's disrupted, could lead to difficulties with emotional regulation or even specific emotional disorders.
Wow. So these networks are like the control centers for our emotions. That makes sense considering how complex our emotional lives are. Now let's step back a little bit and look at the evolutionary perspective. So the book describes evolutionary theories which see emotions as adaptive traits. So things that helped our ancestors survive and pass on their genes.
Right. So from this perspective, emotions are like tools that evolve to solve problems, whether it's finding food or avoiding danger or forming social bonds that enhanced our chances of survival. And it's just really interesting to think about how those ancient evolutionary pressures shaped the way we feel today.
So those butterflies you get in your stomach before a big presentation might be your ancient ancestors' way of like prepping you for a fight or flight response,
Mm.
even if the only threat is like potential awkward silence.
Totally. Or that social anxiety that you might feel at a party. It could be a remnant of our ancestors' need to fit in with the group for safety and support.
It's incredible to think about how our emotions connect us to our evolutionary past. Now let's dive into the cognitive theories, which really emphasize the role of thoughts in shaping our feelings.
Yeah, the core idea here is that how we think about events influences how we feel about them. So take, for example, bumping into a friend that you haven't seen in ages. So that unexpected encounter triggers this flood of thoughts, happy memories, excitement, maybe even relief. And all of those thoughts fuel that feeling of joy that you experience.
It's so true. I think we've all had those moments where our mood just like shifts instantly based on a change in our thoughts.
Yeah.
It's like our brains are constantly evaluating situations, and those evaluations are like what give rise to our emotions.
Exactly. And the term for that process is appraisal. We're constantly sizing things up in relation to ourselves. Are they good or bad? Are they helpful or harmful? Relevant or irrelevant? And those appraisals, they're often lightning fast and unconscious, but they're really shaping our whole emotional landscape.
That's such a powerful idea. It's not just about what happens to us, it's about how we make meaning of those events.
Exactly. And this brings us to Schachter's two-factor theory, which suggests that emotions arise from a combination of physiological arousal and cognitive labeling. It's like our bodies provide the raw ingredients, the racing heart, the sweaty palms, the quickened breathing. And then our minds interpret those sensations and kind of slap a label on them: fear, excitement, anger, whatever fits the situation.
Oh, okay. So like if you're on a roller coaster and your heart is pounding, your mind might interpret that as excitement because of the context.
Right.
But if your heart is pounding because you're walking down a dark alley, your mind might interpret it as fear.
Exactly. The same physiological response can lead to different emotions depending on how we interpret the situation.
That is so interesting. We've been doing a lot of theoretical exploration, and I'm kind of ready to get a little bit more specific.
Yeah.
So the textbook goes on to discuss a whole range of individual emotions: happiness, disgust, jealousy, envy, sadness, grief, love, shame, guilt, anxiety. It's a lot to unpack.
It is. And you know what's fascinating is that even happiness, which we all kind of strive for, can be looked at in so many different ways. So some psychologists focus on the systems of behavior that lead to happiness.
Systems of behavior, what does that mean?
Yeah, so it's this idea that certain behaviors like engaging in meaningful activities, nurturing relationships, or practicing gratitude, they can actually create a foundation for happiness. It's not just about feeling good, it's about actively building a life that supports well-being. It's like we're actively shaping our own happiness instead of just waiting for it to happen. Speaking of shaping our experiences, I'm curious about disgust. It's always seemed like such a primal emotion to me.
It does, doesn't it? Like something just deeply rooted in our biology.
It is, and evolutionary theorists believe that disgust developed as a way to protect us from contaminated food. Think about it, a rotten smell or a slimy texture, it triggers this immediate revulsion, and that helps us avoid things that could make us sick.
Like our bodies are saying, danger, stay away.
Exactly. But disgust isn't just limited to food. It can also be triggered by things that violate our moral or social codes. So it suggests that it also plays a role in shaping our values and our behaviors.
That's really interesting. So disgust might help us navigate like the social world too.
That's the thinking. It kind of helps us set boundaries and maintain social order. Now let's try to untangle jealousy and envy. Two emotions that often get confused, but they have some really distinct differences.
You know, I've always struggled with keeping envy and jealousy straight in my head. They both seem to involve wanting something that someone else has.
It's a common confusion. Jealousy is about the threat of losing something that you already have, typically a relationship, so you feel threatened when you perceive a rival for someone's affections. Envy, on the other hand, is about wanting something that someone else has. It could be a possession, a talent status, anything that you desire but you lack.
Okay, so jealousy is about like protecting what's yours, while envy is more about yearning for what you don't have. They both kind of tap into our social dynamics in interesting ways.
They do, and they really highlight the importance of not only understanding our own emotions, but understanding the emotions of other people, especially in social situations. Because misreading those emotions can lead to all sorts of misunderstandings and conflicts.
Speaking of complex social dynamics, let's touch on sadness and grief. These are tough emotions to deal with, but they're also like essential parts of the human experience.
Absolutely. Sadness is a natural response to loss or disappointment, while grief is a more complex process that involves a mix of different emotions: sadness, anger, guilt, longing, you know, the whole deal. It's important to remember that grief isn't just like a single emotion, it's a journey through all those feelings as we come to terms with loss.
It's like a wave that washes over us. And sometimes those waves are gentle and sometimes they're really rough and turbulent.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And just like we wouldn't tell the ocean to stop having waves, we shouldn't try to suppress or deny our grief. It's a natural part of healing and growth.
And speaking of powerful emotions, let's talk about love. I mean, psychologists have probably spent more time trying to understand love than any other emotion.
Probably true. Love is incredibly complex. It has so many different forms: romantic love, familial love, platonic love, even self-love. And each type involves a different set of emotions, motivations, and behaviors. The textbook mentions Sternberg's triangular model of love. It breaks love down into intimacy, passion, and commitment.
So it's like a recipe for love. You need the right mix of ingredients.
It's a helpful framework for understanding the different facets of love and how they can combine in different ways to create different types of relationships. So, for example, a relationship that's high in intimacy and commitment but low in passion might describe a long-term companionate marriage.
That makes sense. And thinking about the complexity of relationships, let's talk about shame and guilt. They're both self-conscious emotions, but they have very different flavors.
They do. Shame is about feeling bad about who you are, while guilt is about feeling bad about something that you've done. Shame is often linked to a sense of exposure or humiliation, while guilt is more focused on a specific transgression or wrongdoing.
So shame is like, I am bad. And guilt is more like, I did something bad.
Yeah, that's a good way to summarize it. And both shame and guilt can be used for social control. It's like society kind of uses these emotions to enforce norms and keep people in line.
Like that feeling you get when you've let someone down or broken a promise.
Yeah.
You feel guilty, and then that guilt motivates you to make amends or change your behavior.
Exactly. It's a powerful motivator for social cohesion and ethical behavior.
Speaking of powerful emotions, let's shift gears and talk about anxiety. It seems like everyone's talking about anxiety these days, and for good reason. It's so prevalent, and it can have just a huge impact on our lives.
It's true. And the textbook highlights the role of uncertainty and unpredictability in generating anxiety. So when we feel like we don't have control over a situation or we can't predict what's going to happen, that can really trigger our anxiety response.
I've definitely noticed that in my own life. Whenever I'm facing a situation with like a lot of unknowns, my anxiety tends to go through the roof. It's like my mind is trying to prepare for every possible scenario, even if most of those scenarios are totally unlikely.
That's your behavioral inhibition system kicking in. It's this network in your brain that's involved in detecting and responding to potential threats. And so when it senses danger, even if that danger is just perceived, it triggers those familiar anxiety symptoms: the increased heart rate, the sweating, the muscle tension, and that urge to avoid or escape the situation.
It's like our brains are trying to protect us even if the threat isn't real or immediate.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that anxiety, while it's often uncomfortable, is a normal and adaptive emotion. It's only when anxiety becomes excessive or chronic that it becomes a problem.
Now I'm curious about how emotions develop over the lifespan. Do we come into the world fully equipped with our emotional repertoire? Or do emotions kind of unfold and change as we grow?
That's a fascinating question. And the textbook touches on some key points about emotional development. One of the big ideas is that early caregiver relationships play a really crucial role in shaping our emotional patterns.
You mean how our early bonds with our parents or caregivers influence our sense of security and our ability to form healthy relationships later on?
Exactly. Those early interactions lay the foundation for our emotional well-being and our ability to regulate our emotions.
So if a child has like a secure attachment with their caregiver, they're more likely to develop healthy emotional regulation skills.
And that's the idea. They learn that their needs will be met, that they're loved and valued, and that they can depend on others for support. And so this foundation of security helps them kind of navigate the ups and downs of life with greater resilience.
What about kids who don't have that secure attachment? What happens to their emotional development?
Well, if those early relationships are characterized by inconsistency, neglect, or even trauma, it can really disrupt emotional development. And these children may struggle with emotional regulation, they might have difficulty forming healthy relationships, and they may be more vulnerable to stress and anxiety.
That's heartbreaking. It really underscores how important it is to provide children with a safe, nurturing, and loving environment.
Absolutely. And as kids grow, they also develop new cognitive abilities that allow them to experience a wider range of emotions. For example, self-conscious emotions like embarrassment, shame, and guilt. They don't typically emerge until children have a more developed sense of self.
That makes sense. You need to have a certain level of self-awareness to understand things like social expectations and moral standards.
Exactly. And as we move through adolescence and into adulthood, our emotional lives continue to evolve. We become better at understanding and managing our own emotions. We develop more sophisticated ways of expressing our feelings, and we learn to navigate the complexities of social and romantic relationships.
It's like emotional development is this lifelong process of learning and growth, constantly shaped by our experiences and our relationships. And speaking of relationships, I'm curious about how social and cultural factors influence our emotions. Do our social circles and the cultures we're raised in really have that much of an impact on how we feel and express our emotions?
Well, they absolutely do. Remember that concept of emotional climate we were talking about earlier?
Yeah.
That plays a huge role here. Our social environments, whether it's our family, our workplace, or our community, they create this emotional backdrop that influences how we feel and how we're allowed to express those feelings.
So if you're in a social setting where it's not okay to express sadness or anger openly, you might learn to suppress those emotions.
Exactly. And over time, that suppression can become so ingrained that it becomes an unconscious habit. It's like our social worlds are teaching us what emotions are acceptable and how to express them appropriately.
Which makes me wonder about different cultures and how they view emotional expression.
Hmm.
Are some cultures just more emotionally expressive than others?
Definitely. In some cultures, it's perfectly normal to show your emotions really openly and dramatically, while in other cultures, emotional restraint is valued more. And these cultural norms shape our behaviors from a very early age. It's fascinating how these unspoken rules really shape our emotional landscapes.
It's like we're all playing by different emotional rule books depending on where we're raised.
That's a great analogy, and it highlights the importance of being mindful of cultural differences when it comes to emotional expression. What might be considered appropriate in one culture could be seen as completely inappropriate in another.
It's a good reminder to be sensitive and avoid making assumptions about people's emotions based on our own cultural biases. Now, thinking about social dynamics, I'm really fascinated by this idea of emotional sharing that the textbook talks about. And you mentioned earlier that it can have benefits for our mental and physical health, but there are also potential downsides, right?
Right. Emotional sharing can be a powerful tool for processing difficult experiences, building intimacy with other people, and reducing stress. But it's important to do it in a healthy and constructive way.
What do you mean by that? Like choosing the right people to confide in?
Exactly. It's important to choose people who are trustworthy, supportive, and good listeners. It's not helpful to vent to someone who's going to judge you, criticize you, or offer unsolicited advice. You want to feel heard and validated, not judged or dismissed.
That makes total sense. It's like finding a safe space to process your emotions without fear of judgment.
And it's also important to be mindful of the emotional burden that you're placing on the other person. It's okay to ask for support, but you don't want to overwhelm your friends or your family with all of your emotional baggage. Finding a balance is key.
So it's about finding that balance between expressing your emotions and respecting the boundaries of other people.
Right. And it's also important to remember that emotional sharing is not a substitute for professional help. If you're struggling with intense or overwhelming emotions, it's important to reach out to a therapist or a counselor who can provide you with the support and guidance that you need. Sometimes we need more than a friend can offer, and that's okay.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing when you need extra support and seeking it out. Now let's circle back to this idea of universal emotional expressions. The textbook mentions Ekman's research on facial expressions, which suggests that certain emotions are expressed in similar ways across cultures. But you also pointed out that culture still plays a role in how emotions are interpreted and displayed. How do those two ideas kind of fit together?
Well, while there might be some fundamental biological underpinnings to emotional expression, our cultures shape how we learn to express and interpret those emotions. So, for example, in some cultures, it's considered rude to make direct eye contact, while in other cultures, eye contact is seen as a sign of respect and engagement.
So the same facial expression could be interpreted in very different ways depending on the cultural context, which makes it even more challenging to accurately read people's emotion.
Precisely. And it highlights the importance of being culturally sensitive and avoiding making assumptions about how people are feeling based solely on their facial expression.
It's like we need to be emotional detectives, paying attention to both the verbal and the nonverbal cues that people are giving us, and taking into account the cultural context.
That's a great way to put it. And it's a skill that takes practice and attention, especially in our increasingly diverse and interconnected world.
Now let's shift gears and talk about how emotions show up in different areas of our lives, like in the workplace. The textbook talks about the growing emphasis on emotional intelligence as a key ingredient for success. Why is emotional intelligence so important in the workplace?
Well, emotional intelligence is essentially the ability to understand and manage our own emotions and the emotions of other people. And it's become increasingly recognized as an essential skill for effective leadership, teamwork, and communication in the workplace.
I can see how that would be important. The workplace can be a real emotional roller coaster with all the stress and the deadlines and the interpersonal dynamics.
It can be. And people with high emotional intelligence are just better equipped to navigate those challenges. They're more self-aware, they're better able to regulate their own emotions, they have greater empathy for others, and they're more skilled at building and maintaining positive relationships.
So it's not just about being smart or technically proficient, it's about being emotionally intelligent as well.
Exactly. And the good news is that emotional intelligence is a skill that can be developed and strengthened over time. There are specific strategies and practices that can help us become more emotionally intelligent.
That's encouraging. Now, the textbook also talks about the potential for shame in the workplace, particularly around performance appraisals and job loss. What are some of the dynamics at play there?
Well, think about it. Our jobs are often very deeply intertwined with our sense of identity and self-worth. So when we receive negative feedback or we experience a job loss, it can feel like a very personal attack. And it can trigger those feelings of inadequacy, shame, and humiliation.
Especially if that feedback is delivered in a harsher and sensitive way.
Absolutely. And the power dynamics that are at play in many workplaces can exacerbate those feelings of shame. So if you're in a subordinate position and you're being criticized by someone in a position of authority, it can be even more difficult to manage those emotions.
It makes me think about the importance of creating a work environment where people feel safe to make mistakes and learn from them, without that fear of shame or humiliation.
That's so important. A culture of psychological safety where people feel supported and respected can make a huge difference in how people experience emotions at work. So when people feel safe, they're more likely to take risks, be creative, and contribute their best work.
Okay, so we've talked about work. Let's move on to the world of sports, where emotions often run high.
Oh, definitely. The thrill of victory, the agony of defeat. I mean, sports can trigger some of the most intense emotions we experience. And the textbook mentions Wiener's attributional theory of emotion, which explains how athletes' emotional responses are shaped by how they explain the outcomes of their performance.
So it's not just about winning or losing, it's about how you make sense of that outcome.
Exactly. So if an athlete wins a competition and they attribute their success to their hard work, their talent, their preparation, they're likely to feel proud and confident. But if they attribute their win to luck or external factors, those positive emotions might be less intense.
And what about when athletes lose?
Well, if they blame themselves for the loss, they might experience shame, guilt, or self-doubt. But if they attribute the loss to factors that are outside of their control, like a bad call by the referee or an injury, those negative emotions might be less intense.
So it's like the stories that we tell ourselves about our wins and our losses. Those have a huge impact on our emotional experience.
They absolutely do. And this highlights the importance of helping athletes develop a growth mindset, where they see setbacks as opportunities for learning and improvement rather than as personal failures.
Okay, so we've explored work and sports. Now let's dive into the world of the arts where emotions are often front and center.
Yes, the arts are all about evoking emotions, whether it's through the power of music or the immersive storytelling of fiction or the visceral impact of visual art.
I love how art can just transport us to these different emotional worlds and make us feel things that we might not otherwise experience.
It's true, and one of the concepts the textbook talks about is suspension of disbelief. It's that willingness to kind of accept the reality of a fictional world, even though we know it's not real.
Like when we get lost in a good book or a movie and we find ourselves laughing or crying or feeling that suspense right along with the characters.
Exactly. When we suspend our disbelief, we allow ourselves to step into the emotional shoes of the characters and experience their joys and their sorrows as if they were our own. And that can be such a powerful way to cultivate empathy and understanding.
It's like we're expanding our emotional repertoire through art.
That's a great way to put it. We get to try on different emotional experiences in a safe space, and that can really help us understand ourselves and other people better.
Now, the textbook also talks about the emotional power of music. It's like music has this direct line to our emotions, often bypassing our rational minds.
It's true. Music can evoke such a wide range of emotions: joy, sadness, anger, excitement, peace, often without any need for words or explanations. And different types of music can have very different emotional effects on us.
Yeah, like upbeat music can make us feel happy and energized, while slower, more melancholic music might make us feel sad or reflective.
Right, and there's a growing body of research on how music can be used therapeutically to help people manage their emotions, reduce stress, and improve their mood.
That's fascinating. It
Yeah.
makes me think about how art can be such a powerful tool for emotional healing and growth.
It absolutely can be. And it's a reminder of the profound impact that emotions have on every aspect of our lives.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored emotions from all angles, the biological, the psychological, the social, the cultural. I'm feeling a little overwhelmed, but also incredibly inspired by just the sheer complexity and power of emotions.
I know what you mean. It's amazing to think about how much there is to learn about emotions and how much they influence our thoughts, our behaviors, and our relationships.
Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious to hear your final thoughts on what we've discussed. What are some of the key takeaways that you hope our listeners will remember? I know I am. I'm definitely walking away with a new appreciation for how crucial emotions are in our lives. It's easy to get caught up in this idea that we need to be rational all the time, but our emotions play such a vital role.
Totally. I think one of the biggest takeaways from our deep dive today is that emotions are not our enemies. They're not these like unruly forces that we need to constantly suppress or control. Instead, they're these valuable sources of information, guidance, and connection.
That's such an important point. It's like we've been conditioned to think that logic and reason are the superior ways of knowing. But our emotions give us so much valuable data about ourselves and the world around us.
For sure. And they play this vital role in helping us navigate the world, build relationships, make decisions. Imagine trying to make a decision without any emotional input. It'd be like driving a car without a steering wheel.
Another thing that really stood out to me is just how complex emotions are. They're not these like simple one-dimensional things. They're so woven into our biology, our psychology, our social worlds, and our cultural backgrounds.
Right. And there's still so much we don't know about how they work, but the more we learn, the more we appreciate their power and their importance.
And speaking of power, I was really fascinated by those discussions about how emotions can be used for both good and bad, how they can promote things like cooperation and empathy, but also be manipulated for social control or to fuel conflict and prejudice.
Yeah, that duality is definitely something to keep in mind. Emotions can be incredibly powerful motivators, and it's up to us to kind of use that power responsibly. Understanding how emotions can be used and misused is so crucial for navigating the complexities of the world.
It makes me think about the importance of emotional literacy, not just understanding our own emotions, but also being able to recognize and respond to the emotions of other people in a way that's compassionate and constructive.
Totally. Emotional literacy is a skill that can benefit us in every area of our lives. Our personal relationships, our work, our communities, even our political discourse.
And it's a skill that we can continue to develop throughout our lives. It's like learning a new language. The more we practice, the more fluent we become.
Exactly. And just like learning a new language opens up new worlds and new possibilities, developing our emotional literacy can transform our relationships and really enhance our understanding of ourselves and other people.
I'm also walking away from this deep dive with a much greater appreciation for the role of emotional regulation. It's not about denying or suppressing our emotions. It's about learning to manage them in a way that's healthy and adaptive.
For sure. And like any skill, emotional regulation takes practice. But the more we practice, the better we become at handling difficult emotions, coping with stress, and making choices that are aligned with our values and our goals.
It seems like one of the keys to emotional regulation is understanding the link between our thoughts and our feelings.
Right. Remember that concept of appraisal that we talked about earlier?
Yeah, how we interpret events and situations has a huge impact on our emotional responses.
So if we can learn to challenge our negative thoughts and reframe situations in a more positive light, it can help us regulate our emotions more effectively.
Exactly. It's about developing a more balanced and realistic perspective. It doesn't mean ignoring or denying negative emotions, but it means learning to see the situation from different angles and choosing more helpful interpretations.
So much of this just comes back to awareness. Being aware of our thoughts, our feelings, and the stories that we're telling ourselves about our experiences.
Okay, so we talked about the importance of recognizing our emotions, understanding their complexity, being aware of their power, and learning to regulate them effectively. Any other final nuggets of wisdom you want to leave our listeners with?
I think the most important thing is to just approach emotions with curiosity and compassion, both our own emotions and the emotions of other people. Instead of judging or dismissing our feelings, we can try understand them, learn from them, and use them as a source of growth and connection.
I love that. It's like treating our emotions as messengers rather than enemies. They're trying to tell us something, and it's up to us to listen and to learn. Now, before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one final question to think about. We've talked about how our thoughts influence our feelings and how our social and cultural contexts shape our emotional experiences. But given all of these influences, how much control do we really have over our emotions? It's something to think about as you continue exploring this fascinating world of emotions.
That's a great question to leave our listeners with. And as always, there's so much more to explore. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep embracing the full spectrum of human emotion.
Beautifully said. Thanks for joining us on this emotional roller coaster. Until next time, keep diving deep.